pleasure to address you here and to introduce you to the first ever FDA-cleared leukemia and lymphoma in vitro diagnostics. This has been a pretty long path, not necessarily for the company, but certainly for those of us in the flow cytometry community. Just by a show of hands, how many of you in the audience actually do clinical flow cytometry? Okay, well, it'll be interesting to see what you think about the product. So dividing the talk up into three sections. The first is the history. How is it that we got here in terms of having an FDA-cleared product, and what were the drivers behind actually putting this together? Then I'll actually introduce you to the product and some of its features and benefits, and then we can finish up a little bit of discussion. So flow cytometric immunophenotyping was actually developed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was actually developed entirely as a research tool. It was developed by immunologists for immunologists, and the purpose of flow cytometry was to be able to actually study individual cells of the immune system. And as it happens, had it not been for the HIV epidemic, we probably would not be actually using flow cytometry for leukemia and lymphoma today. What actually happened is in the wake of the AIDS epidemic, it was understood that CD4 positive cells were the cells of interest when it came to HIV. And so enumeration of CD4 positive T helper cells was the first assay that was routinely performed in clinical laboratories. And due to the urgency of the clinical situation at the time, these instruments were essentially rushed into the clinical lab. In the course of using the technology and these instruments, those of us who actually do leukemia and lymphoma testing came to understand that if you could use the platform, flow cytometry in general, to look at the normal immune system and diseases that affect the normal immune system, it might be possible to use the same platform to study malignancies of the immune and hematopoietic systems. So by the late 1980s, which is when my career began, flow cytometric immunophenotyping was being applied to hematolymphoid neoplasms. You can see that actually this is the most recent published edition of the WHO classification for leukemias and lymphomas, or hematolymphoid neoplasms. There's actually a dot plot on the cover of the book, which we were really excited to see when it first came out. So it turns out that this technique was incredibly robust. It yielded very detailed, very rapid, typical turnaround if you're in a hurry for a leukemia lymphoma diagnosis by flow cytometry is on the order of 2 hours, actually under 2 hours in some instances, and very reproducible results. And consequently, there was very rapid adoption by both laboratorians who loved the speed and efficiency, and clinicians because they loved the quality of the results, the timeliness of the results. However, because it is so robust, it turns out you can actually get the same answer by using a number of, you don't have to do it the same way. So laboratory A, which might have had the great idea of doing leukemia lymphoma testing by flow cytometry, would not necessarily have been using the exact same reagents as laboratory B. And it turned out that in 1997, when the FDA came out with the ASR rule, actually creating a new category for reagents, analyte-specific reagents, the antibodies that were used in flow cytometric immunophenotyping were covered by ASR. And as part of ASRs are the building blocks, as you know, for laboratory-developed test. You actually put a disclaimer at the bottom of your report saying that the assay was developed and validated in-house, essentially by the laboratory that's reporting the results. So because we had the situation where lots of different laboratories had the really great idea of doing leukemia lymphoma immunophenotyping on a flow cytometer in lots of different places, everybody had different ways of doing it. And so almost as soon as this testing was started, people started trying to come to consensus. Which markers to use, how many markers to use, how to combine them, and which fluorophores to assign to the different markers. This turned out to be remarkably difficult to do. The first of these consensus guidelines actually came out in 1997. That was the US-Canadian. There have been a number of attempts since then. I was involved in one that took place in Montpellier, I think in 2003, and they were actually quite difficult. However, by 2006, it was clearly recognized that we needed to have some idea of what at least, how much agreement there was. And so in 2006, I actually get to participate in this one. A group met in Bethesda, Maryland. This was a essentially global but largely European and North American effort to agree on which markers would comprise the core panel for leukemia lymphoma testing. Now, in 2013, two things happened. There was a set of guidelines issued jointly by ICSH and ICCS, the International Clinical Cytometry Society, again, looking at essentially guidelines for doing this type of analysis. This same year, very importantly, FDA came to understand that what was occurring currently, or at that time, in the clinical laboratories was not ideal. And that because it was the regulatory environment around ASRs that because vendors are not allowed to actually put ASR reagents together, that was actually requiring customers to do it themselves, and that it was not necessarily serving the best interest of laboratories or patients, or, and of course, ultimately vendors. So they could put together a public workshop in 2013. This was one of the first things I ever did when I joined Beckman Coulter, was to go to this workshop. And as a result of that, they did come up with we actually went back and looked at what the results of the Bethesda 2006 consensus to see what were the consensus markers and to see whether or not it would be practical for us to actually to develop an in vitro diagnostic that leveraged that work. So we're going to move on to the product itself. There's a little picture of it here. You can actually see it's 5 vials, and each of those has an antibody combination in it. So it is labeled for in vitro diagnostic use. It comes in a 25 test size, which is reasonable for a typical workflow in a leukemia lymphoma laboratory. There are 5 color cocktails, so it's a total of 18 markers. Typically, when you do flow cytometry, you'll actually have a fair amount of redundancy among the different tubes. So for instance, each of these tubes has CD45 in it, which is used as a gating reagent, and is highly informative for different cells in your sample. They are pre-cocktailed and optimized and literally ready to use right out of the bottle. The sample types include, the labeling includes peripheral blood, bone marrow, and tissues such as lymph nodes tissues. The combinations are, as I said, in alignment with the 2006 Bethesda guidelines, and they are compatible with the WHO revised classification as well. So these are the combinations. We actually have 2 T-cell tubes, 2 B-cell tubes, and a single myeloid tube. And it encompasses the reagents that were described by the Bethesda guidelines as being the core for these analyses. You can actually buy the tubes individually, or you can run the entire panel. It's designed to run on an FC500. This is a single color 5 laser instrument, and the current configuration is one that's it's ready to go for the ClearLab product. It also comes with a compensation solution. Compensation is one of the things that customers tend to struggle with rather more. It's the thing that people are sort of most afraid of, essentially, typically when it comes to flow cytometry, and so it does come with a compensation solution. Now, I'll just show you a little bit in terms of what you see in terms of the markers. Those of you that do flow cytometry will be very familiar with these histograms. On the far left, we have a very characteristic CD45 by side scatter, and then about kappa versus CD19 and CD19 versus CD5. And you can see that here we clearly have for instance, this is a kappa light-chain restricted, low-density kappa light-chain restricted population that co-expresses CD19 and CD5, very characteristic of CLL. Here we have a T-cell lymphoproliferative process. Again, you see the same pattern here. So remember I pointed out we had CD45 by side. We also have CD45 by side here. And again, you see a prominent lymphocyte population. These cells are actually CD2 positive, but they dropped CD7, which is characteristic of of certain T-cell lymphoproliferative disorders. And here you see the CD3. You can see also, interestingly, one of the major, the underlying principles of doing leukemia and lymphoma flow cytometric immunophenotyping is that you actually have normal cells in the sample as well. And you can see the expected normal staging pattern here for the normal CD8 positive lymphocytes that are here. You can see that the CD3 density is relatively decreased to the normal cells. And finally, this is the myeloid tube, and we're showing you a myeloid neoplasm, which has characteristic CD45 low density. So here were the lymphocytes we saw up here that were brightly CD45 positive. These cells are the normal cells in the sample. The abnormal cells here indicated in pink, they're 45 low density. They co-express, they have CD34 and some CD13, but not very much CD33. So one of the things we wanted to be able to, or actually one of the things the FDA really wanted us to include, and we thought it was a really good idea as well, is a case book. So a case book is a set of cases that are analyzed in great detail, and they're analyzed in great detail and show you what to expect when you use the reagents. We actually have both normal and abnormal samples, so you can actually see what the characteristic staining patterns would look like. This is actually a case book for another product, but just to give you an idea, this is the red line. The red line you see there was actually a hot link when you're actually using the book. It'll actually take you to the list mode data, so you can download the data and analyze them yourselves as you would like. So you could potentially use these as a teaching tool to get your staff familiar with the antibody staining patterns. So each of the cases actually includes a clinical vignette. So this would be an example of the type of clinical vignette you'd see. This is actually quite a short one. Simply a 64-year-old male presents with lymphocytosis, peripheral blood sample submitted for flow using all 5 of the clear lab reagent tubes. And so you can actually see the characteristic distribution of the lymphocytes in red, the monocytes in green, and the granulocytes in blue. And here I'm actually showing you one of the annotated dot plots. So each of these cases is analyzed using the exact same the exact same protocol. It's one that's designed in such a way that you should be able to recognize with the appropriate training, which is not this. It's clearly something. This is something you'll be a hematologist or hematopathologist. But when you do that, you'll see the populations of interest. So in this particular case, I've actually described in almost excruciating detail what's happening in each of the dot plots. And as you see as I go through, I have additional information here. And I include things like what's the characteristic staining pattern, what are the normal events. Over here I actually specifically point out that at the bottom of this paragraph it says gate E may also be used to exclude CD45 negative debris from the analysis, but these events should not be ignored when analyzing a case, as some aberrant populations are CD45 negative. And these are the important caveats that you come to know when you're actually proficient at doing this, and we want to call out, specifically note that in the casebook. And these are some more of that excruciatingly annotated dot plots that are the case for every case in the casebook. And then each case sums up with results of the testing, if there was any additional testing, what the final diagnosis was, which may take into account additional immunophenotyping. So just to summarize, the advantages are obviously first is that you're fully compliant. This is FDA cleared for in vitro diagnostics, so you don't really have to worry about the laboratory developed testing. And that it's consensus driven. It is based on expert opinion, essentially global, as to which markers should be included. There's also, I think, for me as a former laboratory director, the workflow aspects of the product are really compelling. I don't have the issues around inventory control. I don't have to cocktail my own antibodies. I don't have to deal with the pipetting and so forth. It's a tremendous improvement in that respect.